We're not sure if Mike Ross, our presenter, is getting audio yet. Mike, or if you could raise your hand if you can hear us. Okay, he's hearing us. For those who are watching online, you can go to kansaslegislature.org, Senate Utilities Committee. On that page, look for miscellaneous and early release testimony. Under that page, there's another area that says early release testimony. You click on that, it'll give you a calendar. You look at today's date, and you'll be able to find the Utilities Committee PowerPoint presentation on a PDF file that we're going to have today. And I'll introduce our speaker here in just a moment. First of all, I want to ask for any bill introductions. Mr. Kreider.
Mr. Chairman, Gavin Kreidler on behalf of the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers, we seek the introduction of RS number 0826, which regards increasing criminal penalties for individuals who damage a critical infrastructure facility.
Committee, any discussion on this? Any objections? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The bill is so introduced. Thank you, Mr. Kreider. Any other bill introductions? Seeing none, I think we're going to move on. We've got a presentation today from Mike Ross, who's the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Southwest Power Pool. And Mike's going to talk about kind of a broad overview of the power pool, and then we'll open it for questions after his brief. Mike, you're free to go.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are y'all hearing me okay?
Yes, yeah, we're pretty good.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for the invitation to appear today. My name is Mike Ross, Senior Vice President with Southwest Power Pool, or SPP. And what I thought we would do is kind of give you an overview, state of the grid, if you will, and then I'll be glad to take any questions that anyone might have. So let's. I understand there's quite a few new members. At one time, the members of the committee had actually visited our campus in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I know there's still a few members that were there and have heard this part of this presentation. We update it annually, but have heard part of it in the past. But it's my understanding there's quite a few new members on the committee, and so thank you for this opportunity. And so we'll so basically there's 7 regional transmission organizations, are independent system operators. The 2 are really synonymous, located in the United States, along with 2 in North America. And as you can see, we're in God's country. We're in the heart of America, stretching from the Panhandle of Texas and parts of Northeast Texas and Arkansas all the way up to the Canadian border. The shaded area that you see at the top, we share a seam with MISO and part of South Dakota and part of North Dakota and a little bit of Montana. So all 7 of these regional transmission organizations are designated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We're regulated by them. Everything we do is based on a tariff that has been approved by them, that is constantly being updated. And we're also audited by FERC, as well as NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation for Physical and Cybersecurity, where we're subject to fines of more than $1 million per day per violation. So of all of America's critical infrastructure, we are the most heavily regulated. And so as I mentioned, we're a nonprofit regulated by FERC, designated by FERC, and also a founding member of NERC as well. And so our mission is helping our members work together to keep the lights on today and in the future. And this is who our members are. And it's pretty evenly divided once you get, once you get past some of the independent power producers and the transmission owning companies and so forth and so on. In terms of those that provide retail service, if you look at those buckets there, about 1/3 of our members are electric cooperatives, about 1/3 are investor-owned utilities, and about a third are public power. In fact, 14 municipal systems, 8 state agencies, and 1 federal agency, WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration, are among our members, as are all the utilities there in Kansas, as well as ITC and others that have a big presence there. So we're regulated, or governed, I should say, by an independent board of directors that comes from literally every part of America. As you can see, we've got a pretty diverse representation on our board, and they come with a lot of experience in the electric industry, among other things. And then we're also partially governed by state regulators. They make up what we call the Regional State Committee. And as you can see, Commissioner French from there in Kansas is among those that help govern Southwest Power Pool. And just to the north of you, Christy Fegan from South Dakota is the president this year of the Regional State Committee. They meet the day before our board meets. They meet independent of our board. There's a joint meeting with our board, and then a lot of them stay for our board meeting the following day. And so their roles largely, the big role they have is cost allocation. So when these transmission lines are built or upgraded, who pays? And so it's state regulators from places like Kansas that meet and determine cost allocation on transmission. They're also responsible for resource adequacy as well as allocation of transmission rights and SPP's markets. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. So our major services, I'm not going to go into all of these, but today I'm going to focus on what I call the big three, and that is reliability coordination, market operations, and transmission planning. So just to be clear, a few things we do not do. We do not site transmission lines. We do not plan or site generation. Those are things left for whoever's building it to work out with their local state regulators. And so reliability coordination. NERC requires every company, every utility to have a reliability coordinator. And basically, think air traffic controllers. They don't own the airport, the runway, the airplane, or the sky, but they direct it all. And whatever happens has to happen based on what they say. And so similarly here, we do not own the transmission lines. We do not own the generation or the substations, but we're directing it to ensure the reliable flow of power across our region. And basically, there's our region. We serve about 17.5 million people, 818 electric generating plants of all types, over 5,000 substations, and about 67,000 miles of transmission. So some of the other grid operators, as I mentioned, there's 7 in the United States. A couple of them, they serve more load, more people than we do. But even in those instances, they have about the same miles of transmission we do. That's because largely we serve a very rural part of the country. And just so you'll know, of that 67,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines, 10,210 miles of those are in the state of Kansas. Only Oklahoma has more miles of high voltage transmission lines than Kansas within the SPP region. And then markets, I guess, is the second bucket. And so transmission service. So back before there was a regional transmission organization, if you had some power and you wanted to sell it to someone, and between you and them was 4 different transmission owners, you literally had to pick up the phone at one point in time and call 4 different transmission owners and try to negotiate a price and schedule time on their lines. Because as you know, you can overload lines, you can underload lines. They might get to the 3rd or 4th phone call and find out that that transmission owner couldn't accept it at that given time. Then they'd have to start all over again. And so transmission service request is part of our market where it's one-stop shopping, and we facilitate the buying and selling of or use, if you will, of regional transmission lines to move power. And then our integrated marketplace. And we've been coordinating power in one way or another since 1941. But in 2014, we launched what we call our integrated marketplace, and it includes two aspects, day ahead. And so the day ahead market, for example, this morning, we were forecasting how much power is going to be needed tomorrow. And then the market opens, and those generators that want to commit to run tomorrow, they bid. And whatever the lowest price is that gets us to the amount of power we need tomorrow, then that's what they're all paid. So it ensures the lowest cost of electricity runs first. And it also has a reliability component. These large generators are making a commitment with financial penalty that, yes, I will run tomorrow. And then we have what's called a real-time balancing market. So maybe the load forecast was slightly off. Maybe a generator committed to run, but, you know, it's a big machine. Maybe it broke down. For whatever reason, we have a real-time balancing market that literally settles every 5 minutes to fill in the gaps, if you will. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but, you know, up until recently, all we had to do is forecast how much power is needed tomorrow. Now we're having to forecast what's the wind going to be doing tomorrow, and we'll be talking more about that in a little bit. So just some market facts. I won't go over all those. All the members have a copy of this, and I believe it's on your website as well. But just the points I would make is on transmission service transactions. That's about a $4 billion a year business within our market, and then settling electricity is about $19 billion, and that's the two things I think I would point out on that slide for you. So as of October 7th of 2020, we're still trying to get our end of year numbers in. Our integrated market has now been up and running for about 7 years, and we have saved our members and their ratepayers about $3.64 billion as of October 7th. The average annual savings is about $750 million. And FERC, most recent number was 2019, as we're just beginning 2021 now. But FERC had us listed at Southwest Power Pool as the lowest cost wholesale energy provider in the nation back in 2019. And you can see what's happening with renewables. In 2008, we had about 6,000 megawatts of wind on the system. Today, it's approaching 25,000 megawatts, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. This is what's available to us within the SPP region. This is the generation that's available. Gas, there's more gas than anything else, followed by wind and then coal. Those are the big three. And so basically, we don't choose the winners and losers. We don't choose coal over wind or wind over gas. It's the market that does that. So of that 95,000 megawatts that was available for us in 2020, the next slide will show you what ran based on the market. And what I guess is significant here is wind replaced coal as our number one fuel source in 2020. Just barely, but it did. As you can see, wind makes up 31.3% of our energy mix for 2020. Coal was at 30.9%. Natural gas was at 26.6%. And then you can see the other 10% was largely nuclear and hydro. Not a lot of solar on the system yet, but that's coming, as well as storage, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit as well. Just because I'm presenting in Kansas, I wanted to show you what does Kansas contribute to the region. And 43% of your energy is coming from wind, 31%, 32% really is coming from coal. And y'all are the leader, quite frankly, within the SPP region with nuclear at nearly nearly 20%. The other point I'd make is the chart on the right. As you can see, y'all have about, in Kansas, about 53,000 megawatts of generation available. Your demand is only about 43,000 megawatts. So that's what we would refer to as a net exporter of energy. So you're able to take advantage of our integrated marketplace to sell excess power to those other states that need it. And so this is what's been happening. Oftentimes, the SPP region is referred to as the Saudi Arabia of wind. It's the richest region in the country for wind because that's where the wind blows the most is our region. And you can see what's happened since 2011. In 2011, 63% of our energy was coming from coal, 6% from wind. Gas has pretty much maintained the same, running between 24 and 27% during that time period. But as you can see, in 2020, wind overtook coal, again, just barely, about a half a percentage point, but wind did overtake coal as our number one fuel source. And here's why. I mean, we're up to over 27,000 megawatts of wind installed on the system today. That's coming from over 11,000 wind turbines at 200 plus wind farms. And here's a few statistics for you. The maximum wind output that we've seen in the SPP region on the system is almost 20,000 megawatts, and that occurred January 14th of this year. But look at the next number. The minimum wind output, which occurred on January 9th of this year, was only 252 megawatts of wind. So that's a big jump from 252 to nearly 20,000. Our maximum wind penetration is at 73.2%. That occurred back about a year ago. And the average for 2020 was 32.6%. And so I do want to make this point, and this is why having a diverse fuel mix is important. I mentioned earlier, not only do we have to forecast how much power is going to be needed from day to day, but we're also, required to forecast what's the wind going to do. And we've had to get really good at it, and we have. And there were no reliability issues back on December 11th of 2019, and there's many other dates since then that we could make the same example with, but I think this was the largest swing that we saw back on December 11th, 2019. And we forecast it coming, so there were no reliability issues. But basically, in 21 hours, we lost 16,000 megawatts of wind on the system. To put that another way, that's like turning on 32 large gas or large coal plants, 32. So you can see on December 11th, wind was making up 51% of the energy in the 14 states. 21 hours later, it was down to 6%. What saved us? Gas went from 16 to 35%. Coal went from 23 to 46%. Again, we're fuel agnostic. We don't choose the winners and losers. The market does. But I can tell you, if it wasn't for the fast start, quick start natural gas generators, there is no way that we could set these North American RTO records for wind penetration. And we're the first RTO to have wind as our number one fuel source as of the end of last year. So fast start, quick start natural gas, those are the generators that can go from being off to running maximum anywhere from 10 to 60 minutes. And we have at our disposal about 153 of those units, making up about 8,000 megawatts. But we forecast the wind days in advance, so if there's a coal plant that's not running, it can take sometimes more than a day to get it up and running. Similar for some of the large, older natural gas plants, and that's why we're forecasting days in advance. But we're able to integrate more than 70% wind on the system reliably, largely because of these fast start, quick start natural gas units. And so what does the future hold? Again, we don't decide what kind of generation is built. That's what our members do. But we sort of, we get to look into the future because anyone that wants to build new generation within the SPP system is required for us to do a study on how that new generation would reliably connect to the electric grid. And so that's what the future looks like. 44% of what's planned for the future is wind. Solar today is about 2% of our, I'm sorry, less than 2% of our energy mix. I think we only have about 200 megawatts of solar on the system today, but there's almost 36,000 megawatts of solar planned. Storage was not even a category when I was presenting there in Topeka just a few years back. Now we're up to almost 9,000 megawatts of storage that's planned. And then gas, about 5,000 megawatts of gas, and that is pretty much all the fast start, quick start natural gas that I was referring to earlier. And then the third bucket is transmission planning. It's a big part of what we do. And so, you know, basically we look at transmission planning as it based on reliability, economics, and public policy. And we're looking near term, but we're also looking long term. We're looking 10 years out, 20 years out, and 30 years out on what kind of upgrades, what kind of lines are needed. And here's why. From the time you start talking or thinking about a new line until it's in service can be about 8.5 years. You can build most generation in under 2 years, but you've got to have the transmission to get the power from where it's made to the population centers where it's needed, and that can take as much as 8.5 years to complete the entire process. And basically, since 2005, our independent board of directors have issued what we call notices to construct on about $10 billion in new transmission. A lot of that has helped facilitate the wind growth that we've seen in our region. And about $8.5 billion of that is completed, about $2 billion left to do in scheduled projects. About $1 billion was done in 2020. Looks like about $750 million is planned for 2021 to get in service. And again, who pays for regional transmission, the high voltage lines? Again, this allocation is determined by state regulators that make up our regional state committee. And as you can see, basically the large lines are paid for 100% by the region. Medium-sized lines, it's about 33% by the region and about 67% locally. And then the small lines are paid for by the local zone. And those are the transmission lines where projects were either constructed or have notices to construct that will be coming in service. And you can see Kansas has fared quite well, and that's largely because you've got so many wind resources. So what's next for SPP? We're moving west, and we're excited. We're excited about that. And here's why. If you remember early on, I showed you the map of regional transmission organizations in the United States. And once you leave the SPP region, there's no organized markets, no regional transmission organization until you reach California. And so the logical provider for the West is us, because basically the country's divided into three interconnections. You have the Eastern interconnection, which we're in. You have the Western interconnection. And then, of course, you have Texas. They have their own. And so there are 7 direct current ties, if you will, that connect the east to the west. And because of where we fall and where our region stops, today we already manage those 7 DC ties. And so back a little over a year ago, we became the reliability coordinator for the area in yellow or gold, depending on what your screen looks like. And then February 1st, just what was that, 2 days ago, our Western Energy Imbalance Market went live with the 2 largest electric cooperatives in the country, Tri-State and Basin, being members, as well as WAPA, a federal agency. And we're pleased to announce that it went live on schedule, on budget, as planned on February the 1st at midnight with no issues. And now several utilities in the West have announced their interest in joining our regional transmission organization, which would then provide them all these other benefits. They're getting reliability coordination. They're getting basically the real-time market, the Western Energy Imbalance Service market with full RTO membership. That would include transmission planning as well as our day-ahead market. So we're excited about moving west. And as I pointed out earlier, Kansas has more generation than they have load, and so this will be even more markets or more potential ways for them to export excess energy. And so that pretty much, Mr. Chairman, concludes my prepared remarks, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Mike, very comprehensive. I've got a bunch of questions, but I want to open it up to the committee first. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask of Mike. Senator Hawk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mike, I always enjoy your presentations when you come every year. Thanks for doing that. You mentioned on one of your slides about storage as I think 8,923 megawatts. Is that under study? What is the status of commercial scale storage to complement or supplement wind generation that we have, particularly here in Kansas and in the Southwest Power Pool?
Senator Hawk, it's good to see you and hear your voice, and I wish I could be there with you in person, and hopefully that will be the case next year. Good question. Basically, all those numbers I shared about the generation interconnection requests, they're all under study. That means companies that want to build generation have paid deposits for this to be studied. A lot of times, not everything that gets studied ends up getting built. Maybe the interconnection costs were too high. Maybe there were reliability issues involved in it, but these percentages will probably stay the same. It's just the amount of megawatts that reflect those percentages could change some. It's up again to the individual company whether they actually build the generation after we complete our studies. Storage, I think, has a lot of potential for the future. I can tell you that think about this. When we set these North American wind records, wind blows the most at night when load is the lowest. And so even when we're setting these records, we may be curtailing or preventing 2,000 megawatts of wind from even getting on the system for reliability reasons. And so, and again, the cost to build a transmission line can be $1 to $3 million, and you've got to, again, get the power from where it's made to where it's needed. If you could pair storage with wind, and the same can be said for solar, but we have so much wind, I'll give that as an example. If there were storage units on site at wind farms, and if you could use that same $1 to $3 million a mile transmission line, and when you're curtailing wind in the middle of the night, if you could curtail it into those storage units and then call on them as a separate generator during peak times of the day, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe over time, storage could replace some of these other fuel sources as a backup for when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. But I think we're a ways away. I think it's going to happen quicker than we think. But I would compare storage today. It's kind of like my first cell phone was like, it was like a brick. It was like a 5-pound bag phone. And if you put a magnetic antenna on the roof and if you stopped on top of a hill, you might make a call. It's a long way from being one of these gadgets we carry today. But with technology, I think and the push for more carbon-free, and really it's financial institutions and large companies that are really in a lot of ways, ahead of federal policy on the push for reducing carbon. So I think storage, when people say we're going to get to 100% renewable by 2050, well, it's easy to say because 2050 is a long time off. But, the wind, I showed you the drastic drops you can see in wind. The same thing, solar is even less reliable because you can't really forecast a cloud that may come over and just literally knock out the power, maybe for a brief moment, but it happens. I think when people talk about 100% renewable energy, the only way we can ever get there is with storage. And even then, I think at a minimum, you're going to have these fast start, quick start natural gas generators in your back pocket.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good to see you, Mr. Ross. I'm sorry we can't be down there in Arkansas, but appreciate your joining us. First question I had was really regarding, your forecasting of use of electricity, and I know you do that on a day-to-day basis. What forecasts, or if any, has the Southwest Power Pool looked at as we see moves toward electric cars and more use of electricity throughout our region?
You cut out right there before the electric car part. What was that part? I'm sorry.
Apologies. So I was wondering, you do the day-ahead marketing and forecasting of use. So is there any long-term forecasts that you're looking at as opportunities for electric cars, more electric appliances are coming into use throughout our region?
Senator Francisco, it's good to be with you again, and she's actually even attended some of our board meetings in the past. Thank you for the question. And so when we're forecasting wind and load, that's a reliability function. But when we're looking at the grid of the future, if you will, and we actually have an initiative at SPP called the Grid of the Future, and so that plays more into the modeling we do in terms of what kind of load are we going to see in future years, and that is used primarily to determine whether transmission upgrades are needed or new lines are needed. It's an excellent question, and everything's changing so fast. I've heard a lot of different experts in this field talk in the last few years about, you can predict what you think it's going to look like 5 years out, but you'll likely be wrong. But I think everyone agrees that the future is going to include electric cars. GM just announcing that I think in 14 years, they're saying their entire fleet of pickups, SUVs, and cars are going to be electric, and they'll quit making gas-powered cars. So you're going to see a lot of that. We're also going to see a lot more efficiencies in the batteries, and we're also going to see a lot more efficiencies in the use of electricity. And so it's a real challenge, but that's what we try to do is take the information we have available today, and the science we have available today, and that helps us model, what does the grid look like in the future? And again, that's an initiative at SPP right now called Grid of the Future. Excellent question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then my second question had to do with how pleased I am to see the additional Western states and their interest in our Southwest Power Pool, particularly when we look at solar generation in our area. Often that generation is not matched up with the highest peak use. So as we see opportunities to put solar on the grid and in that forecast that's farther west, will that help us meet some of those peak times just because it's a more east-west extension of that power production?
We think it will, and actually the most solar-rich area in our region is the Panhandle of Texas and western Oklahoma and western Kansas, and a lot of what's planned, you know, in the future is in terms of solar in our region. A lot of that's happening in that area, you know. And I probably should note that when I say we've got nearly 36,000 megawatts of solar planned, that is solar solar energy that will end up on the high voltage transmission lines. Basically, we're not seeing a lot of load growth right now, and none of the other regional transmission organizations in the country are either. It's pretty much steady, and part of that can be contributed to the solar that, you know, a lot of companies are putting what we call behind the meter solar, that either goes straight to the source or to the local distribution lines and never actually enter the high voltage SPP grid, if you will. And so the 36,000 megawatts of solar that's planned, that is what would be on the grid, if you will. And there's a lot that's already built out there, as you know, for companies, for small towns, some of the electric co-ops, and even some of the investor-owned and public power have done what we call behind the meter, that actually never gets on the grid. That's really not part of the market, if you will. But we see a lot of advantages to taking on some of these western states, and some of it is as simple as there's a time zone change, and so the peak for us is different than the peak for them. And so that can benefit us. It can benefit them, and they have some wind and some solar in some of the western states. But if you look at the map, I mean, I think only Oklahoma has more potential for wind than Kansas anywhere in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. But we feel like the larger the market, the greater the opportunity for exporting renewables that are more than we need, and in our region, and also the more players you have in the market, the more you're going to reduce the cost of wholesale electricity. Good question. Good. I appreciate the comment and support of what we're doing in the West.
Senator Bowers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we miss seeing you in person, Mike. We do. I have a couple questions, if I might, Mr. Chairman. As SPP grows and moves west and wind grows, which I'm in north central Kansas, so I'm definitely seeing that, how will the transmission costs affect our ratepayers in Kansas? Do you have an opinion on that?
So we've done if you refer back to where was that? I think I'm going the wrong way. If you look at what we've done since 2005, you know, there's only about $2 billion left scheduled in new transmission at this time, and right now, you know, those are issues to be determined. But as we grow west with reliability coordination, there's no transmission cost involved with that. And as we offer the Western Energy Imbalance Market, there's no cost associated with that. There's now a study on some of those entities in the West joining the RTO. And then the question is, will those entities in the Western Interconnect, will that be a regional allocation separate from the Eastern Interconnect? And that's something that will be determined by our regional state committee, and Kansas, as I mentioned, Commissioner French is on that, and that is years away. So if it happened at all, some talk about, do we need greater bandwidth, if you will, with those DC ties that connect the east to the west? I think our path now is somewhere around 2,000 megawatts. That's an issue several years out to be determined, who pays what on that. But right now, 80% of the transmission plant has already been built, and there's not a lot left to do after 2021 if you look at page 28. I will say that we have done a study, and for every dollar you invest in transmission, you save $3.50. It reduces, and we've seen that's one of the reasons we've got the lowest wholesale electric rates in the country is transmission facilitates lower cost energy being able to get to the market. Good question.
One more, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and then I'll finish. I'm curious at the federal level with our new administration, new president, do you see any changes for coal, wind, and solar that we could be looking for coming out? Do you have a crystal ball for us?
I don't think it's any secret that President Biden is pushing for less carbon, more renewables. But we haven't had any change in federal energy policy. Some of you know this. I was in the state Senate in Arkansas 10 years, in Congress 12 on the Energy Committee, and helped write the Energy Policy Act in 2005. And that was the last federal energy policy that's been passed in Congress. And really, I think it's the public and large customers that are demanding less carbon and more renewable energy. And a lot of these industries, they're demanding that in order to locate in an area. And so in some ways, it's kind of like when, who was it, President Obama proposed this cap and trade business. And I always said that based on the targets he was doing on what he wanted to do, if it really didn't matter what the government did, because I feel like the public were ahead of them, and most of those goals have been met much sooner than what he proposed in that legislation that really never went anywhere. And so, but I would expect to see more push on renewables, probably through production tax credits and so forth and so on, and more push for less carbon-based energy in the future. But if you look at what's going on in our market, it's already happening anyway. And so, the only thing I think to watch for is there are some out there that want to push for basically a direct current interstate highway for high voltage electricity that in some ways would fly over America's electric grid to deliver energy from renewable rich areas to load centers that aren't as renewable rich. But that's been tried before and failed. And, that's one of the things I'll watch to see if that gets resurrected again.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. I have a question actually in regard to that. Just curious about where the transition from DC to AC happens. Is it at the point of generation? For example, wind turbines, do they have the inverters on the turbines and do the transfer from DC to AC there, or is it done at a dispatch center? I'm just curious.
I'll have to get, Senator or Mr. Chairman, I'll have to get back to you on that. I'm not an electrical engineer, and I'm not exactly, I've never got that question before. I do know that, for example, on these DC ties that connect the east and the west, what happens is as we move power from the east to west and vice versa, and that's going on all the time. We control the flow of that again because of where we fall on the system, and so like when power reaches that DC tie between the east and the west, it goes through a substation, steps up, becomes a DC current, crosses, and then goes back to a substation, steps down to AC, and goes on out again, as I understand it.
Okay, I was just curious about that.
That's how that part works.
Okay, well, we can find out. I was just kind of curious about that. And do you do the actual dispatching at the Southwest Power Pool Center in Little Rock, or do you have the various power dispatchers throughout the Southwest Power Pool who manage the load throughout the area?
That's a good question. It's all coordinated from Little Rock. We have 2 operation, or really, as a result of COVID, we now have 3 operation centers in case we had a COVID outbreak at one center and needed to suspend operation there for cleaning and so forth and so on. So we actually now have 3 operation centers to be sure we never lose control of the system, if you will. And so most of it's done by computer. We're literally sending a signal about every 4 seconds to over 800 generators on whether they need to increase or decrease generation. And then at each member company, they largely have their own operation centers that are taking those signals and acting accordingly to actually control the flow of power from those generators.
And
so we'd be sending a signal to Evergy, for example, and then they would be taking action based on that for the generation under their ownership.
gotcha. So you actually do the dispatching of power throughout the whole area, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. One other question with regard to this, the pressure to go toward renewables versus, the traditional base load. Are you concerned that that mix is going to get too heavy into renewables and that we're going to price out our base load plants? The variability in wind is never going to go away. The same with solar. My concern is that we drive down the wholesale cost of electricity so frequently that, we're going to drive some of these baseload plants out of business and create some reliability issues.
And I know that's been a concern, and that's why I tried to, because wind we are the first RTO to have wind as our number 1 energy source. And again, we don't decide that, the market does. But as you know, I was very quick to point out that if it wasn't for the gas and coal in our energy mix, we would have had reliability issues when we see these significant drops in wind. And maybe someday storage and fast start, quick start natural gas can fill those gaps, but right now, for us to be hitting 70% plus wind penetration for 14 states in a given moment, we couldn't do that if we didn't have these other, if we didn't have a diverse fuel mix, these other fuel sources to back us up. The last coal plant actually built in America is in Southwest Arkansas in the SPP region, and it'll probably be the last one left running in America because it's the newest, it's the cleanest. But in terms of the crystal ball, what kind of generations planned for the future, we don't see coal in the mix. We see some natural gas, largely fast start, quick start. We see a lot of wind, solar, and storage. A lot of the coal plants are getting older. Again, it was federal policy in the 70s that basically said stop using natural gas to make electricity, and that's when there was a big rush to move to coal. But again, that was in the 70s, and this is 2021, and a lot of those are reaching end of life, regardless of this transition that we're seeing.
Any other questions from the committee before I ask Mike? Senator Fack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I look at this miles of transmission lines, that map, it's kind of interesting that it looks like the 230 KVs up north, and then you got the red 345 and then turns green. Is there any rhyme or reason to that? In way
it's moving? In terms of the size of the line?
Yeah, it seems like they get bigger the farther south you get.
It just has to do with how much generation you're trying to put on a line. The more power, if you will, that you need to put on a line, the bigger the line needs to be.
Yeah.
So for example, it may be a smaller line if you're trying to move wind from a few wind farms in a rural area to a load center. If you've got a lot of generation, the more generation you have, the larger the line.
Yeah. Okay.
or the more
Senator
load.
Hawk.
Mike, I have a couple questions about integrated resource plans and statewide energy plans. As you talked about how Southwest Power Pool operates in terms of dispatching power, do all the utilities or states require integrated resource plans on their public utilities? And what role does Southwest Power Pool play in that? You probably talked about that in one of the other presentations, but.
The resource adequacy is left to the states. So basically within the SPP region, each member, each load serving member, they have to bring the amount of power they need for their region or for their distribution area to the table. And how they do that is something they work out with their state regulatory body. And so every state, I'm sure, does it a little bit different, but the resource planning is left to the states. And as I mentioned, the Regional State Committee, which is made up of state regulators, they do discuss regional resource adequacy, if you will. But it's again, we don't decide what kind of generation's built. That's left to our members and their regulators. All we're required to do is a study on how that new generation would reliably connect to the electric grid. Good question.
So kind of piggybacking off that, we've had 2 rate studies that the legislature has encouraged, and we have gotten those. What's the status of statewide energy plans in the states that participate in the Southwest Power Pool? Do you know? And does that affect how you function in the Southwest Power Pool? I'm not sure where we are on statewide energy plans and our state and even surrounding states.
Right, and that's at the discretion of each state. We have 17 states in our region. Some have energy plans, some don't. Again, all we're doing is ensuring reliability on the system, planning future transmission, and facilitating the market based on what the states allow our members to put on the system, if you will.
I would assume that those studies that you mentioned when I asked you the question about the storage, and that some of those that are commissioned would be a pretty important thing to look at in a statewide energy plan. And I assume that information, does that become available through Southwest Power Pool, or not sure how that connects?
Yes, sir. All the studies we do, we're required to be very transparent, and spp.org is the public location for all the studies that we do and everything.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions, committee? I just have one last question, Mike. Senator Thompson here. Nuclear. Do we even, I know the regulatory problems and the cost problems, do we even see that in the future mix?
You know, I don't know. It would just be a guess. You know, in terms of generation planned in our region for the future, there's no nuclear plan. I know there is a nuclear plant being built, I believe, in Georgia that's had significant cost overruns and delays and a lot of issues. But you know, as we move toward a carbon-free future, you know, I think there may be further discussion about the use of nuclear energy in the future. You know, can we fill in the gaps left from renewables with storage and gas? Would nuclear be cleaner? There's just so many issues out there. I look for it to be a discussion in the future, but all I can speak to is the present time and the generation plan in our region. There's no nuclear. It's wind, it's solar, it's storage, and it's natural gas generation.
Okay.
Good question.
Any other questions before we leave? Seeing none, Mike, thank you so much. We really appreciate your expertise and a very comprehensive overview of what you guys do, and we appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you. And with that, I believe we are adjourned. We do have a committee meeting again tomorrow. We won't meet on Friday, but with that, we're adjourned.